The year was 1816, and England basked in the afterglow of Wellington's victory at Waterloo. London's high society had never been more resplendent, more rigid, or more ruthlessly hierarchical. In the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair, beneath crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow prisms across silk wallpaper, the aristocracy conducted their elaborate social ballet with the precision of a military campaign. Lady Evangeline Ashworth stood at the tall windows of Ashworth Manor, watching the morning mist rise from the manicured gardens that stretched toward the Thames. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that inspired poets and bankrupted suitors: alabaster skin that had never known the touch of common sunlight, auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, and eyes the color of emeralds that seemed to hold secrets even she did not yet understand. The Ashworth fortune was legendary, built upon shipping routes that connected London to the farthest reaches of the empire. The family coat of arms, a golden ship sailing beneath 3 stars, adorned everything from the marble foyer to the finest china. Earl Reginald Ashworth, Evangeline's father, commanded respect in Parliament and fear in his business dealings. The Countess Cordelia Ashworth ruled society with an iron fist wrapped in the finest French silk. "Evangeline, darling, you must come away from that window," her mother's voice carried across the morning room like the rustle of taffeta. "The Duke of Whitmore arrives within the hour, and your posture suggests you've been reading those dreadful novels again." The morning room itself was a testament to aristocratic taste, walls painted in the softest shade of ivory, adorned with portraits of Ashworth ancestors who gazed down with expressions of perpetual disapproval. Delicate Chippendale furniture was arranged with mathematical precision, while Persian rugs in deep burgundy and gold created islands of warmth across the polished oak floors. Evangeline turned from the window, her morning dress of pale blue muslin rustling softly. The dress itself was a work of art, empire waist accentuated with seed pearls, sleeves that fluttered like butterfly wings, and a hemline that revealed the smallest glimpse of silk slippers embroidered with silver thread. "Mother, surely the Duke can wait. The morning is too beautiful to waste on marriage negotiations." The Countess raised an eyebrow, a gesture that had silenced countless social climers. Her own attire spoke of understated power: a dark green silk gown with intricate beadwork, a diamond necklace that had belonged to 3 generations of Ashworth women, and a bearing that suggested she had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with proper etiquette and sufficient wealth. Marriage negotiations? The Countess's laugh was like the tinkling of crystal. "My dear child, the Duke of Whitmore is not here to negotiate. He is here to claim what has already been arranged. Your father and the Duke finalized the agreement last evening. You shall be announced as the future Duchess of Whitmore at the Pemberton Ball tomorrow night." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to disturb the very air of the room. Evangeline felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation of walls closing in despite the room's generous proportions. "But mother, I have not even spoken with the Duke privately. How can I marry a man I barely know?" "Knowledge comes with time, affection with duty," the Countess replied, adjusting a perfect curl that had dared to slip from its appointed place. "The Duke possesses £40,000 a year, estates in 3 counties, and a bloodline that traces directly to the Plantagenets. What more could any reasonable woman desire?" Through the windows, Evangeline could see the servants beginning their daily rituals. The head gardener directed his staff in tending to rose bushes that bloomed in perfect formation, while stable boys exercised thoroughbred horses whose coats gleamed like polished mahogany. Everything at Ashworth Manor moved according to schedule, according to tradition, according to the immutable laws of social order. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the Duke's arrival. Evangeline watched from the window as a magnificent black carriage, emblazoned with the Whitmore coat of arms, drew to a halt before the main entrance. 6 perfectly matched bay horses stamped impatiently while livery-clad footmen rushed to attend their duties. The carriage itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, lacquered to mirror brightness, fitted with gold fixtures that caught the morning light, and bearing window glass so clear it might have been made from captured air. "Evangeline," her mother's voice carried a note of warning. "Your father expects you in the library in 15 minutes. Wear the pearl necklace, the large one, not the delicate strand. The Duke must understand the full extent of our family's resources." As her mother swept from the room in a rustle of silk and the faint scent of French perfume, Evangeline remained at the window. Below, she watched the Duke of Whitmore emerge from his carriage. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, impeccably dressed in a dark blue coat with gold buttons, buff-colored breeches, and riding boots polished to perfection. His bearing spoke of military training and aristocratic breeding, but his face, even at this distance, seemed carved from stone, handsome in the way a Greek statue is handsome, but equally cold and remote. The Duke's valet, a thin man with sharp features, followed closely behind, carrying a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained the final marriage settlements. Everything about the scene spoke of transaction rather than romance, of duty rather than desire. Evangeline touched the window glass, feeling its coolness against her fingertips, and wondered if this was how birds felt when they first noticed the bars of their cages. In the distance, beyond the manicured gardens and perfectly trimmed hedgerows, she could see the beginning of the wild heath that stretched toward the village. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of her family's influence, people lived simpler lives governed by their own choices rather than the dictates of bloodline and fortune. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Miss Evangeline?" The voice belonged to Sarah, her lady's maid since childhood. "Your mother requests that you change into the ivory silk with the pearl trim. She says it brings out the green in your eyes." Evangeline turned away from the window, away from the glimpse of freedom it offered, and nodded. "Of course, Sarah. We mustn't keep the Duke waiting." But even as she spoke the words, she felt something stirring within her, a restlessness that had been growing stronger each day, a voice that whispered of possibilities beyond the gilded boundaries of her world. The transformation from morning dress to formal reception attire was a ritual as elaborate as any court ceremony. Sarah worked with the efficiency of long practice, unlacing the simple muslin gown and replacing it with the ivory silk that seemed to float around Evangeline's form like captured moonlight. The pearl trim caught the light from the tall windows, creating tiny stars across the bodice and sleeves. "You look beautiful, miss," Sarah murmured as she arranged the heavy pearl necklace around Evangeline's throat. "Like a princess from one of those fairy tales you used to love." "Fairy tales," Evangeline repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose this is rather like a fairy tale. The princess in her tower, the prince arriving to claim her hand." She paused, studying her reflection in the gilt-framed mirror. "But in the stories I remember, the princess was usually being rescued, not sold." Sarah's hand stilled for a moment. "Miss Evangeline, you mustn't speak so. Your parents only want what's best for you." "Do they?" Evangeline turned to face her maid, this woman who had been more mother to her than the Countess in many ways. "Sarah, tell me honestly, if you had been born with my advantages, would you marry a man chosen by others?" The older woman's face showed the struggle between honesty and loyalty. "Miss, I was born to a world where women don't have such choices. But you were born to privilege. Perhaps that comes with different responsibilities." It was a diplomatic answer, but Evangeline saw the truth in Sarah's eyes. Even this woman, who had spent her life in service, understood that marriage should be more than a merger of estates and titles. The realization that her own maid possessed a freedom of choice that she, for all her wealth and status, did not, struck Evangeline with startling force. "5 minutes, miss," Sarah said gently, making final adjustments to the drape of the silk skirt. "Your father doesn't like to be kept waiting." As Evangeline descended the grand staircase toward the library where her future awaited, she felt as though she were walking toward her own execution. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to watch with approval, generation after generation of Ashworth women who had made suitable marriages, who had done their duty, who had never questioned the price of their comfort. But with each step, the voice of rebellion grew stronger. Somewhere beyond these walls, beyond the reach of titles and dowries, there had to be another way to live. And for the first time in her 22 years, Lady Evangeline Ashworth began to wonder if she might be brave enough to find it. The library at Ashworth Manor was a temple to learning and power, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. Persian rugs in deep burgundy created islands of warmth across the polished floor, while tall windows filtered the morning light through mullioned glass, casting geometric patterns across mahogany furniture that had witnessed decades of important decisions. Earl Reginald Ashworth stood behind his massive desk, a piece crafted from a single oak tree that had grown on Ashworth lands for 200 years. The Earl himself was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered despite his 58 years, with silver hair that caught the light like spun platinum and eyes that could assess a man's worth with a single glance. His morning coat of deep blue superfine wool bore no ornamentation save for the gold signet ring that marked him as head of one of England's most powerful families. "Whitmore," the Earl said, extending his hand to the Duke who stood before the fireplace examining a first-edition volume of Shakespeare. "Punctual as always. I admire that in a man." The Duke of Whitmore closed the book with careful precision and turned to face his host. At 42, he possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that spoke of Norman bloodlines and generations of careful breeding. His features were sharp and aristocratic, high cheekbones, a nose that suggested Roman coins, and gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they surveyed. His attire was impeccable, a coat of charcoal gray superfine, buff-colored breeches that fitted without a wrinkle, and boots that reflected the morning light like black mirrors. "Ashworth," the Duke replied, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eton and Cambridge. "I trust the settlements meet with your approval. My solicitor has assured me that every detail reflects our previous discussions." The Earl moved to a sideboard laden with crystal decanters, each containing spirits that had aged longer than most men lived. "Brandy? It's from Napoleon's own cellars, acquired quite legally, I assure you, after Waterloo." The crystal glasses caught the light like captured diamonds as he poured 2 measures of the amber liquid. "Excellent." The Duke accepted his glass, swirling the brandy with the practiced gesture of a connoisseur. "To profitable alliances." They drank in the manner of men who understood that marriage among their class was business first, with any personal sentiment being a fortunate but unnecessary addition. The silence that followed was comfortable, born of mutual understanding rather than affection. "Your daughter," the Duke said eventually, settling into a leather chair that had been crafted during the reign of Queen Anne. "I trust she understands the advantages of our arrangement." The Earl's smile was sharp as winter frost. "Evangeline is a dutiful daughter. She has been raised to understand her responsibilities to family and station. You will find her accomplished in all the arts considered appropriate for a lady of her position, French, Italian, watercolors, pianoforte. Her dowry, as discussed, includes the estates in Surrey and Devon, plus the shipping interests in the West Indies trade." "Admirable." The Duke nodded approvingly. "And her temperament?" "I have little patience for dramatic sensibilities or romantic fancies. She reads, perhaps more than is entirely proper, but shows no signs of revolutionary thinking. The Countess has supervised her education personally, ensuring she understands the importance of discretion and propriety." The Earl paused to sip his brandy. You will find her beautiful, well-mannered, and sufficiently intelligent to manage a ducal household without embarrassing herself or you." As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock interrupted the discussion. "Enter," the Earl commanded, and the massive oak door swung open to reveal Evangeline herself. She moved with the gliding grace that marked a lady of breeding, her ivory silk gown catching the filtered sunlight like captured moonbeams. The pearl necklace at her throat seemed to glow with inner fire, while her auburn hair was arranged in the classical style that flattered her oval face. But it was her eyes that gave both men pause, those remarkable green eyes that seemed to hold depths that neither wealth nor breeding could fully explain. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that was perfectly executed yet somehow managed to suggest the barest minimum of enthusiasm. "Father." The Duke rose, his movements precise and controlled. "Lady Evangeline." He bowed with mathematical correctness. "You are even more beautiful than your portrait suggested." "You are too kind, Your Grace." Her voice was carefully modulated, revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. She accepted his offered hand, noting its coolness even through her silk gloves, and allowed herself to be led to a chair position to catch the best light. "I have taken the liberty of outlining the general terms of our arrangement," the Earl said, settling behind his desk like a general surveying a battlefield. "The formal announcement will be made tomorrow evening at the Pemberton Ball. The wedding will take place in 6 weeks, allowing time for proper preparations." 6 weeks, Evangeline repeated, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not rebellion exactly, but perhaps the shadow of questions she dared not voice. "That seems quite soon." "Soon enough to satisfy propriety, yet allowing sufficient time for the Countess to order your trousseau from the finest houses in London," the Duke replied. "I have arranged for the ceremony to take place at St. George's, Hanover Square. The Archbishop himself will officiate." The conversation continued in this vein for perhaps 20 minutes, covering the practical details of their future life together with the same emotion one might use to discuss the purchase of a racehorse. Evangeline responded when required, smiled when appropriate, and displayed the perfect manners that had been drilled into her since childhood. But beneath her composed exterior, she felt as though she were drowning in silk and circumstance. "I believe," the Duke said eventually, "that a brief walk in your gardens would be appropriate. Lady Evangeline, would you do me the honor?" It was not really a question, and they all knew it. Evangeline rose gracefully, accepting the light pelisse that Sarah had brought for the purpose. "It would be my pleasure, Your Grace." The gardens at Ashworth Manor were a masterpiece of landscape design, created by Capability Brown himself during the previous century. Gravel paths wound between perfectly manicured flower beds where roses bloomed in mathematical precision. Ornamental trees cast shadows that fell in pleasing patterns, while a small lake reflected the sky like a mirror designed by angels. They walked in relative silence, the Duke occasionally commenting on the excellence of the gardening or the classical proportions of the various ornamental structures. Evangeline responded politely, but her attention was caught by movement near the estate's boundary where the formal gardens gave way to wilder countryside. A figure on horseback was approaching at considerable speed, not the measured pace appropriate for a gentleman's morning ride, but the urgent gallop of someone with pressing business. As the rider drew closer, Evangeline could see that it was a man she did not recognize, mounted on a horse that, while clearly well-bred, lacked the perfect grooming expected in her world. "I say," the Duke observed with mild disapproval, "someone appears to be in rather unseemly haste." The rider slowed as he approached the boundary between wild heath and cultivated garden, and Evangeline found herself studying him with an attention that surprised her. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair that showed signs of having been disheveled by his rapid ride. His clothing, while clean and well-made, was clearly that of a gentleman of modest means, a simple brown coat, buckskin breeches, and boots that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. But it was his face that captured her attention. Where the Duke's features spoke of cold aristocratic perfection, this stranger possessed a countenance that seemed alive with intelligence and passion. His eyes, even at this distance, appeared to sparkle with humor, and when he smiled at something his horse did, the expression transformed his entire face. "Probably some local yeoman farmer," the Duke said dismissively. "They often forget their place when they acquire a bit of prosperity." The stranger had dismounted now and was examining his horse's foreleg with the careful attention of someone who genuinely cared for the animal's welfare. There was something in his manner, a gentleness combined with competence, that made Evangeline continue watching even as the Duke attempted to direct her attention to a particularly fine specimen of topiary. "We should return to the house," the Duke said eventually, having exhausted his observations about the horticultural arts. "I have promised to call upon the Marchioness of Blackwood this afternoon, and punctuality is the virtue of princes." As they turned back toward the manor, Evangeline cast one last glance toward the boundary where the stranger had been. But he had remounted and was already disappearing into the distance, leaving only the memory of a smile that had somehow seemed to promise worlds beyond the careful constraints of her own existence. "Your Grace," she said impulsively, "do you know all the families in the district?" "The gentleman on horseback, I do not believe I have seen him at any social gatherings." The Duke's expression suggested that he found her curiosity mildly inappropriate. "I make it a point not to concern myself with the local gentry unless they possess sufficient importance to warrant attention. No doubt your father could provide details if the matter is of genuine consequence." But Evangeline found herself hoping that it was not a matter of consequence to anyone but herself. There had been something about the stranger, something free and alive and utterly different from everything she had known, that made her feel as though she had glimpsed a different way of being in the world. As they approached the manor house, with its perfect facade and its rows of symmetrical windows, she felt the familiar weight of expectation settling around her like a beautifully embroidered shawl that was nonetheless a burden. In 6 weeks, she would become the Duchess of Whitmore, mistress of multiple estates, one of the most influential women in England. So why did the memory of a stranger's smile make her feel as though she had just seen the key to a prison she had not even realized she was in? The Duke departed shortly after their return, with promises to call again before the formal announcement. Evangeline stood in the drawing room, still wearing her ivory silk and pearls, and watched his perfect carriage disappear down the drive with feelings she could not entirely identify. "Well?" The Countess appeared at her elbow with the silent grace that marked her as a practiced observer of human nature. "I trust the Duke met with your approval." "He is everything you described, Mother. Accomplished, well-bred, appropriate in every way. Yet you sound as enthusiastic as a prisoner discussing her sentence." The Countess studied her daughter with eyes that missed very little. "Evangeline, I hope you are not entertaining romantic fantasies. The Duke of Whitmore represents security, position, and influence that will benefit not only you but our entire family." "I understand, Mother." Evangeline turned away from the window, away from the view of the gardens where she had first glimpsed another possibility. "I shall do my duty." But even as she spoke the words, she found herself wondering about the stranger on horseback, about the life he led beyond the boundaries of her carefully ordered world, and about what it might feel like to choose one's own path rather than simply accepting the one laid out by others. The afternoon stretched ahead of her with its usual routine of accomplishments and obligations, but for the first time in her life, Lady Evangeline Ashworth found herself dreaming of escape. 3 days after her formal introduction to the Duke of Whitmore, Evangeline found herself trapped in the suffocating routine of wedding preparations. The morning room at Ashworth Manor had been transformed into a command center for matrimonial logistics, with fabric samples draped across every surface, invitation lists spread across the mahogany writing desk, and the Countess issuing orders with the precision of a field marshal. "The Brussels lace simply will not do for the ceremonial veil," her mother declared, holding a delicate sample up to the light streaming through the tall windows. "It lacks the gravitas appropriate for a future duchess. We must send to Paris immediately for the Alisal lace, the same pattern used for the Duchess of Devonshire's daughter." Evangeline sat surrounded by silks and satins in every shade of ivory imaginable, each fabric representing choices that felt increasingly remote from her own desires. The wedding dress itself was to be a masterpiece of the dressmaker's art, empire waist accentuated with seed pearls, sleeves of the finest silk gauze, and a train long enough to require 6 pages to manage properly. "Perhaps, mother, we might consider a simpler design," Evangeline suggested, running her fingers over a bolt of cream-colored silk that seemed to glow with inner warmth. "Something more personal." The Countess's expression suggested she had just heard her daughter propose appearing at court in a farmer's smock. "Personal? My dear child, this wedding will be attended by 300 of the most important people in England. The Archbishop of Canterbury will officiate, the Prince Regent himself may attend, and every detail will be discussed in drawing rooms from London to Edinburgh. Personal considerations are a luxury we cannot afford." Through the windows, Evangeline could see the gardeners working among the rose beds, their movements efficient and purposeful as they tended to blooms that existed solely for the pleasure of others. The metaphor was not lost on her. She was being cultivated with the same careful attention, prepared for display at the appropriate moment, with no consideration for her own inclinations or desires. "I believe I shall take some air," she announced, rising from her chair with a rustle of morning dress muslin. "The room grows close with so much activity." "Take your parasol," the Countess replied without looking up from the lace samples. "The sun will damage your complexion, and we cannot have you looking anything less than perfect for tomorrow evening's announcement." Evangeline escaped the manor through the French doors that led from the morning room onto the terrace. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the formal gardens spread before her in their autumn glory. But instead of following the prescribed paths that wound between carefully tended flower beds, she found herself drawn toward the estate's boundary where wildness began to encroach upon cultivated perfection. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, her kid leather boots making soft sounds on the gravel paths, when she heard voices ahead, one speaking with the cultured accents of education, the other responding in the broader tones of the local countryside. Curiosity overcoming propriety, she moved closer to investigate. Hidden behind a large oak tree that marked the transition between formal garden and natural woodland, she discovered the source of the conversation. The stranger she had seen riding 3 days earlier was crouched beside an injured fox, speaking in soothing tones while examining what appeared to be a damaged foreleg. Beside him stood one of the Ashworth gamekeepers, a weathered man named Thompson whom Evangeline had known since childhood. "The trap caught her front leg, Mr. Sinclair," Thompson was saying. "Poachers, most likely. They don't care what gets hurt so long as they take what they want. No permanent damage, thankfully," the stranger, Mr. Sinclair, replied, his hands gentle as he examined the small creature. "But she'll need care for several days. I have a place where she can recover safely." Evangeline watched, fascinated, as this man who was clearly a gentleman showed such tender concern for a wounded animal. In her world, foxes were either hunted for sport or considered pests to be eliminated. The idea of actually caring for an injured one was so foreign to her experience that she found herself stepping closer for a better view. The movement must have caught Mr. Sinclair's attention, for he looked up suddenly, his dark eyes meeting hers with an impact that seemed to stop her breath in her throat. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Evangeline felt as though the entire world had narrowed to this single point of connection. "Miss," he said, rising gracefully to his feet while keeping the injured fox secure in his arms. I apologize if we have disturbed your walk. His voice was as she had imagined it would be, educated but warm, with an undertone of humor that suggested he found life more amusing than burdensome. He was taller than she had realized, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical activity rather than purely social pursuits. His clothing, while well-made, was practical rather than fashionable, a brown wool coat that showed signs of actual use, buckskin breeches that fitted comfortably rather than fashionably tight, and boots that had clearly walked many miles. Not at all, Evangeline replied, finding her voice at last. I was merely exploring the boundaries of our estate. Your estate? His eyebrows rose slightly, and she realized he had not recognized her as the Earl's daughter. Without the elaborate gowns and jewels that marked her station, dressed simply in a morning dress of pale green muslin with only a small string of pearls for ornamentation, she supposed she might indeed be taken for a member of the upper servants or perhaps a governess. Lady Evangeline Ashworth, she said, offering a slight curtsy that seemed absurdly formal given the circumstances. The change in his expression was immediate and complex, surprise, certainly, but also what appeared to be disappointment. Your ladyship, he said, his bow perfectly correct but somehow lacking the warmth his voice had held moments before. Marcus Sinclair, at your service. Mr. Sinclair. She studied his face, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes, the firm line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead in defiance of any attempt at formal styling. You are not from this district originally. I am newly arrived, he admitted, his attention returning to the injured fox. I have taken a small property near the village, nothing grand, but sufficient for my needs. Thompson cleared his throat diplomatically. Begging your ladyship's pardon, but Mr. Sinclair here is the new physician. Came down from Scotland to take over old Dr. Whitmore's practice. A physician? Evangeline felt her interest sharpen. Here was a man who had chosen a profession based on calling rather than inheritance, who worked with his hands to heal rather than simply managing estates built by others. How admirable! Something in her tone must have conveyed genuine interest rather than polite condescension, for Mr. Sinclair's expression warmed slightly. I find it rewarding work, though I fear it provides little opportunity for the social graces your ladyship is accustomed to. Perhaps that is not entirely a disadvantage, she replied before she could stop herself, then blushed at her own boldness. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, the same smile she had glimpsed from a distance 3 days earlier, and its effect at close range was even more devastating than she had imagined. You surprise me, Lady Evangeline. In my experience, ladies of elevated station generally prefer their gentlemen to possess more traditional accomplishments. Your experience may be somewhat limited, she heard herself saying, and was astonished at her own daring. Perhaps not all ladies value the same qualities. The fox stirred in his arms, reminding them all of the creature's plight. If you will excuse me, your ladyship, Mr. Sinclair said, I should see to this little one's immediate needs. Of course. But as he turned to go, she found herself calling after him. Mr. Sinclair. Will the fox, will she recover fully? He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and exhilarated simultaneously. With proper care and time, yes. Wild things are remarkably resilient when given the chance to heal. The words seemed to carry meanings beyond their surface, and Evangeline felt color rising in her cheeks. I am glad to hear it, she managed. She watched him walk away, noting the easy confidence of his movement, the gentle way he carried the injured animal, the manner in which he spoke to Thompson as an equal rather than a social inferior. Everything about him suggested a man comfortable with himself and his place in the world, a sharp contrast to the calculating formality that characterized her usual social circle. When they had disappeared into the woods, Evangeline remained standing beneath the oak tree, her heart beating with an irregularity that had nothing to do with her walk. She had just spent more genuine conversation with a stranger than she typically exchanged with people she had known for years. The realization was both thrilling and disturbing. "Lady Evangeline?" A voice behind her caused her to turn quickly. Sarah was approaching along the garden path, her expression concerned. "Your mother is asking for you, miss. Something about the final fitting for your court dress." "Yes, of course." Evangeline fell into step beside her maid, but her thoughts remained in the woodland clearing where a man's kindness to an injured animal had somehow opened a window into possibilities she had never considered. "You look flushed, miss," Sarah observed with the license of long familiarity. "Perhaps you walked too far in the sun." "Perhaps." But Evangeline knew that no amount of sunshine could account for the warmth that seemed to have settled permanently in her chest, or the way Mr. Sinclair's smile had made her feel as though she were seeing the world clearly for the first time. The return to the morning room felt like entering a different universe. The Countess was deep in conversation with Madame Laurent, the French seamstress who had been summoned from London specifically to create Evangeline's trousseau. Bolts of fabric, lace samples, and sketches of gown designs covered every available surface, while the air hummed with discussions of hemlines, necklines, and the subtle gradations of status that could be conveyed through the proper choice of trim. "Ah, there you are," the Countess said without looking up from a particularly elaborate design for a court presentation gown. "Madame Laurent needs to confirm the measurements for your traveling costume. We cannot have you arriving at Whitmore Castle looking anything less than perfection itself." Evangeline submitted to the measuring and fitting with the patience born of a lifetime's practice, but her mind kept drifting to dark eyes and gentle hands, to a voice that spoke with passion about healing rather than duty. She found herself wondering what it would be like to be touched with such tenderness, to be looked at as though she were a person rather than a prize. "You seem distracted, chérie," Madame Laurent observed in her accented English. "Perhaps you are thinking of your handsome Duke, non?" "Perhaps," Evangeline murmured, but the man filling her thoughts possessed none of the Duke's cold perfection. Instead, she was remembering the way Mr. Sinclair had cradled the injured fox, the genuine concern in his voice, the way he had treated Thompson with respect rather than condescension. That evening, as she sat through another elaborate dinner with guests chosen more for their titles than their conversation, Evangeline found herself imagining what it would be like to dine simply, to talk about ideas and dreams rather than marriage settlements and property acquisitions. When the Duke, who had joined them for the meal, spoke at length about his plans for improving the drainage on his Derbyshire estates, she pictured herself instead listening to stories of healing, of lives saved and suffering eased. "You are unusually quiet tonight, my dear," the Duke observed during a pause in his detailed description of agricultural innovations. "I trust you are not developing a headache?" "I find that ladies of delicate constitution often suffer from nervous complaints during periods of excitement." "I am quite well, Your Grace," she replied, forcing herself to smile appropriately. "Merely contemplating the magnitude of the changes ahead." "Admirable," he nodded approvingly. "A thoughtful approach to marriage is the mark of a sensible woman. I am pleased to see that you understand the seriousness of the commitment we are undertaking." Seriousness. Commitment. The words fell between them like stones, and Evangeline felt the familiar weight of expectation settling over her once again. But somewhere beneath that weight, a small flame of rebellion continued to burn, fed by the memory of a smile that had seemed to promise freedom rather than constraint, healing rather than mere duty. Later that night, as Sarah helped her prepare for bed, Evangeline found herself asking, "Do you know anything about the new physician in the village?" Sarah's hands paused in their work of brushing out her mistress's long hair. "Mr. Sinclair. I've heard he's a good man, miss. Educated in Edinburgh, they say, and skilled in the healing arts. Why do you ask? I encountered him today during my walk. He was tending to an injured animal. Evangeline studied her reflection in the mirror, noting the way her eyes seemed brighter than usual. It was kind of him. Kindness is a rare quality among gentlemen, Sarah said carefully, resuming her brushing. Especially toward creatures that cannot repay the favor. Yes, Evangeline agreed softly. Very rare indeed. As she lay in her bed that night, surrounded by the luxury that had defined her entire life, Lady Evangeline Ashworth found herself dreaming not of duchesses' coronets and grand estates, but of gentle hands and understanding eyes, of a man who chose to heal rather than simply to possess. And for the first time since her engagement had been announced, she allowed herself to wonder what it would feel like to be loved for herself rather than for her fortune and breeding. The thought was dangerous, impossible, and utterly intoxicating. The Pemberton Ball was the social event of the autumn season, held in the magnificent ballroom of Pemberton House with its soaring ceilings painted by Italian masters and crystal chandeliers that transformed candlelight into cascading diamonds. The cream of English society gathered in their finest silks and jewels, creating a glittering tableau of wealth and privilege that had changed little in the 50 years since the current Earl's grandfather had first opened these doors to the ton. Lady Evangeline stood beside the Duke of Whitmore at the head of the receiving line, her gown a masterpiece of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had required 3 seamstresses working around the clock to complete in time. The Ashworth diamond sparkled at her throat and wrists, heirloom pieces that had graced 5 generations of family brides, while her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of hours of patient work by the most skilled ladies' maids in London. She looked, by any objective measure, absolutely perfect. The Duke himself had commented approvingly on her appearance, noting that she would photograph beautifully for the formal portraits that would commemorate their engagement announcement. His own attire was equally impeccable, a black evening coat tailored by the finest houses on Savile Row, white silk stockings, and knee breeches that were the mark of highest formal dress, decorated with the Order of the Garter and several other honors that proclaimed his importance to anyone who might have missed the point. Lady Evangeline, the Countess of Pemberton, gushed as she approached with yet another group of well-wishers, "You look absolutely radiant. Such happiness becomes you, my dear." Happiness. The word seemed to echo mockingly in Evangeline's ears as she smiled and accepted congratulations from people who knew nothing of her feelings and cared even less. Around her, the ballroom swirled with the elaborate choreography of high society, ladies in gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, gentlemen whose titles stretched back to the Norman Conquest, all moving through the prescribed patterns of courtesy and conversation that had been refined over centuries. The formal announcement had been made during dinner, with the Duke rising to address the assembled company in a speech that had all the warmth of a legal document. He had spoken of the joining of 2 great houses, of the advantages that would accrue to both families, of the pleasure he took in acquiring such an accomplished bride. Evangeline had been referred to throughout as though she were a particularly fine piece of property, valued for her bloodlines and dowry rather than any personal qualities. Such a fortunate match, Lady Pemberton continued, fanning herself with ivory and lace. The Duke is considered one of the finest catches in England. You have done exceptionally well for yourself, my dear. Yes, Evangeline replied automatically. I am very fortunate indeed. But even as she spoke the expected words, her eyes searched the crowded ballroom for something, anything, that might offer respite from the suffocating predictability of it all. The orchestra played the same pieces they always played, the guests discussed the same topics they always discussed, and she felt herself disappearing into the role of the perfect aristocratic bride like an actress who had forgotten she was performing. It was then that she saw him. Marcus Sinclair stood near one of the tall windows that overlooked the Pemberton Gardens, partially concealed by heavy velvet draperies that pooled like dark water at the base of the glass. He was dressed appropriately for the occasion in evening attire that, while not of the finest cut, was perfectly respectable. But it was not his clothing that caught her attention, it was the way he seemed to exist in a sphere of calm observation while the social storm raged around him. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and Evangeline felt the familiar flutter of her pulse that had become associated with his presence. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but made no move to approach her. Indeed, given her position as the evening's guest of honor and his status as a gentleman of modest means with no social connections, such an approach would have been highly inappropriate. "My dear," the Duke's voice at her elbow recalled her attention. "Lord Blackwood wishes to discuss the possibility of a shooting party at his estate in Scotland next month. I have taken the liberty of accepting on both our behalf. Of course, Your Grace." She forced herself to focus on the conversation, on the plans being made for her future that seemed to involve everyone except herself. But throughout the next hour of social obligations, she remained acutely aware of Mr. Sinclair's presence in the ballroom. She watched as he moved with quiet grace through the peripheral areas of the room, speaking briefly with a few of the less exalted guests, the younger sons of minor gentry, the wives of prosperous merchants who had bought their way into society's outer circles. His manner was courteous to all, but she noticed that he seemed to gravitate toward those who, like himself, existed somewhat outside the inner circles of power and privilege. When the dancing began, Evangeline performed her duty admirably, accepting the Duke's arm for the opening minuet and then allowing herself to be passed from one appropriate partner to another. She danced with earls and viscounts, with heirs to ancient titles and gentlemen of impressive fortunes, all the while maintaining the gracious demeanor expected of a lady of her station. But when Lord Pemberton's eldest son, a young man known more for his gambling debts than his conversational skills, led her into a country dance that positioned the couples in two long lines facing each other, she found herself directly across from Marcus Sinclair. The shock of proximity nearly cost her the first figure of the dance. He was partnering Miss Catherine Westfield, the daughter of a prosperous wool merchant who had recently purchased a small estate in the district. Miss Westfield was a pleasant young woman of perhaps 20, with the kind of unaffected manner that suggested she had not yet learned to hide her genuine feelings behind society's required mask. As the dance progressed through its intricate patterns, bringing partners together and then separating them again, Evangeline found herself intensely aware of every moment when the figures brought her close to Mr. Sinclair. During one particularly complex turn that required the ladies to pass between their partners and the gentleman opposite, she found herself briefly hand in hand with him. The contact lasted only seconds, but the warmth of his fingers through their respective gloves seemed to burn through the silk and lace like flame. His dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her feel as though they were entirely alone despite being surrounded by dozens of other dancers. "Lady Evangeline," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the music. "You look beautiful this evening." The compliment, simple as it was, affected her more profoundly than all the elaborate praise she had received throughout the evening. There was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, that suggested he saw beyond the diamonds and silk to the woman beneath. "Thank you," she managed, and then the pattern of the dance separated them again, leaving her to complete the remaining figures with trembling hands and a racing heart. When the music ended, proper etiquette demanded that she return to the Duke's side for the next set. But as the gentlemen bowed and the ladies curtsied, she found herself reluctant to leave the small space of floor where, for a few brief moments, she had felt truly alive. "Evangeline." The Duke appeared at her elbow with the punctuality of a well-regulated clock. "The Marchioness of Blackwood wishes to discuss the arrangements for your wedding breakfast. It would be appropriate for you to join her in the withdrawing room." "Certainly, Your Grace." She allowed him to escort her from the ballroom, but not before casting one last glance toward the spot where Mr. Sinclair had been standing. He was gone, however, and she felt an absurd sense of loss that was entirely disproportionate to the brief nature of their encounter. The withdrawing room was a smaller, more intimate space where the ladies could repair their appearance and engage in conversation away from masculine company. The Marchioness of Blackwood, a formidable woman of 60 whose opinions carried considerable weight in society, held court near the fireplace where a cheerful blaze cast warm light across walls lined with silk and adorned with portraits of Pemberton ancestors. "My dear child," the Marchioness began without preamble, "I have been discussing your upcoming nuptials with the Duke, and I must say that Whitmore Castle would be the perfect setting for your wedding breakfast. The great hall can accommodate 300 guests comfortably, and the ducal kitchens are renowned throughout England." The conversation that followed covered every detail of the wedding celebrations with exhaustive thoroughness: the menu, the flowers, the seating arrangements that would reflect the precise social hierarchy of the guests. Evangeline participated when required, offering opinions on matters that seemed increasingly remote from any personal preference. "You are very quiet tonight, my dear," observed Lady Catherine Morrison, the Duke's sister, who possessed all of her brother's aristocratic hauteur with none of his occasional attempts at charm. "I trust you are not developing cold feet? The Duke mentioned that you seemed somewhat distracted during dinner." "Not at all," Evangeline replied, forcing herself to smile appropriately. "I am simply overwhelmed by the generosity and kindness everyone has shown." "Overwhelmed," Lady Catherine repeated, her pale eyes studying Evangeline with uncomfortable intensity. "Yes, I suppose the transition from Earl's daughter to Duchess can seem daunting. But you will find that duty provides its own rewards, and the Duke is not a demanding husband so long as his household runs smoothly and his social obligations are met appropriately." The description of marriage as a series of household management tasks and social duties struck Evangeline with particular force. Was this what her life was to become? An endless succession of dinner parties and estate business, of managing servants and entertaining guests who valued her only for her title and connections? "I am sure Lady Evangeline will adapt admirably," the Marchioness interjected. "The Ashworth family has always produced women of exceptional capability. Her mother was one of the finest hostesses of her generation." As the conversation continued around her, Evangeline found her thoughts drifting once again to the brief moments in the ballroom when Mr. Sinclair's hand had touched hers. There had been something in that contact, a sense of recognition, of possibility, that made everything else seem pale and insubstantial by comparison. When they finally returned to the ballroom, the evening was well advanced and many of the guests were beginning to take their leave. The Duke was engaged in conversation with several gentlemen near the card-room, their discussion apparently centered on some matter of parliamentary business that would resume when the House reconvened. Evangeline found herself standing near one of the tall windows, ostensibly watching the late arrivals and early departures in the torchlit courtyard below, but actually searching for any sign of Mr. Sinclair. The ballroom seemed somehow diminished by his absence, as though a light had gone out without her realizing it had been illuminating her world. "Lady Evangeline." She turned to find Miss Westfield approaching, her pleasant face showing signs of the fatigue that came from spending an entire evening being charming to people one barely knew. "Miss Westfield. I hope you have enjoyed the evening." "Oh yes, very much." The younger woman's smile was genuine, unmarked by the calculation that characterized most social interactions. "Though I must confess, I find these grand occasions somewhat overwhelming. There are so many rules to remember, so many people to whom one must show the proper degree of respect." "Yes," Evangeline agreed, thinking of the endless protocols that governed every aspect of aristocratic life. "It can be exhausting." "Mr. Sinclair was just saying much the same thing," Miss Westfield continued innocently. "He mentioned that he finds country practice much more satisfying than the social obligations that seem to consume so much of genteel life. Such a refreshing perspective, don't you think?" At the mention of his name, Evangeline felt her pulse quicken. Mr. Sinclair seems to be a man of decided opinions. Indeed. And such kindness. He has been treating my younger brother for a fever that had the previous physician quite baffled. Tommy is completely recovered now, thanks to Mr. Sinclair's care. Miss Westfield's expression grew thoughtful. There is something so admirable about a gentleman who chooses to dedicate his life to healing others, don't you think? So different from those who simply inherit their purpose along with their estates. The observation struck Evangeline with uncomfortable accuracy. Everything in her own world, her fortune, her position, even her marriage, had been determined by accidents of birth rather than personal choice. The idea of a man who had deliberately chosen his path in life, who had trained and studied to develop skills that could genuinely help others, seemed almost revolutionary in its implications. Yes, she said softly. Very admirable indeed. Later that evening, as her carriage rolled through the darkened countryside toward Ashworth Manor, Evangeline sat in silence beside her parents while they discussed the evening's successes. The Countess was particularly pleased with the approval the engagement had received from various important personages, while the Earl noted several invitations that had been extended for the coming months. But Evangeline heard little of their conversation. Instead, she found herself reliving those brief moments when she had felt truly seen and valued for herself rather than her title and fortune. The memory of Mr. Sinclair's eyes meeting hers across the ballroom, of his gentle voice calling her beautiful, of the warmth that had passed between them during the dance, seemed to glow in her mind like embers that refused to be extinguished. For the first time in her life, Lady Evangeline Ashworth began to understand the difference between duty and desire, between what was expected and what was possible. And the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. The morning after the Pemberton ball dawned grey and drizzling, with the kind of persistent English rain that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Evangeline woke with a restless energy that the previous evening's festivities had done nothing to quell. If anything, the brief encounter with Mr. Sinclair had left her more unsettled than before, as though a door had been opened onto possibilities she had never dared to imagine. She dressed carefully in a riding habit of deep green velvet that complemented her eyes, telling herself that she merely required vigorous exercise to clear her head of foolish fancies. But as she made her way to the stables, she knew she was lying to herself. The path she chose would take her near the village, past the modest house where Dr. Whitmore had practiced for 40 years and where his successor now tended to the medical needs of the district. The head groom, a weathered man named Patterson who had taught her to ride when she was barely tall enough to reach her pony's stirrups, helped her mount Artemis, a spirited mare with a coat like burnished copper. "Shall I accompany you, my lady?" he asked, noting the direction of her intended route. "The weather looks to worsen before it improves." "That won't be necessary, Patterson. I shan't go far, and Artemis knows these paths as well as I do." The lie came easily to her lips, though she felt a pang of guilt at deceiving this man who had served her family faithfully for decades. The ride through the countryside provided exactly the solitude she craved. The rain had driven most sensible people indoors, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the rhythmic sound of Artemis's hooves on the muddy lane. The landscape that surrounded her had been her entire world for 22 years, rolling hills dotted with sheep, neat farmhouses sending smoke curls into the gray sky, ancient stone walls that had marked property boundaries since medieval times. But this morning, familiar sights seemed to mock her with their very familiarity. Every vista reminded her of the narrow confines of her existence, the predetermined path that stretched ahead of her with all the inexorability of fate itself. In 6 weeks, she would marry the Duke of Whitmore and become mistress of estates she had never seen, responsible for managing households full of servants who would judge her every decision, entertaining guests who would value her only for her connections and influence. The village of Little Thornfield appeared ahead of her like something from a painting, its thatched cottages and stone church tower emerging from the mist with picture-book perfection. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, suggesting warm firesides and simple domestic comfort that seemed infinitely appealing after the elaborate formality of the previous evening. Dar. Whitmore's house stood at the village's heart, a modest Georgian building of honey-colored stone with a brass plate beside the front door that now bore the name, M. Sinclair, physician. A small garden stretched between the house and the lane, its autumn flowers providing spots of color against the gray morning. Evangeline dismounted near the church, ostensibly to examine a historical marker that commemorated some long-forgotten battle, but actually to study the physician's house while maintaining a pretense of casual interest. As she stood there, holding Artemis's reins and trying to appear absorbed in medieval history, the front door opened and Mr. Sinclair himself emerged. He was dressed for riding in a coat of brown wool that had clearly seen considerable use, and he moved with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to making house calls regardless of weather. In his medical bag, a well-worn leather case that spoke of practical service rather than fashionable appearance, she could see the tools of his trade, instruments designed to heal rather than to impress. He had reached his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding that looked capable of covering considerable distances without complaint, before he noticed her presence. The surprise on his face was evident, but it was quickly replaced by something warmer, pleasure, perhaps, or simple human recognition in the midst of professional routine. "Lady Evangeline," he said, touching his hat in acknowledgement. "You are abroad early this morning, and in weather that would keep most people by their firesides." "I find that riding clears the mind," she replied, acutely aware of how inadequate the explanation sounded. "Particularly after social obligations." A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, the same expression that had so affected her the previous evening. "Ah yes, the Pemberton ball. I trust it met with all expectations." It was, everything such events are meant to be. She found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes, the lines that suggested he smiled often, the way he seemed genuinely interested in her answer rather than simply making polite conversation. "That sounds like diplomatic phrasing for something less than complete satisfaction," he observed, beginning to check his horse's bridle with the automatic efficiency of long practice. The comment was more perceptive than anything anyone had said to her in years. Most people, particularly men, simply assumed that her engagement to the Duke represented the pinnacle of female ambition achieved. "You are very observant, Mr. Sinclair." "Occupational hazard, I'm afraid." A physician learns to look beyond surface appearances to discover what truly ails his patients. He paused in his preparations, studying her with professional interest. "Though I would not presume to diagnose what troubles a lady of your elevated station. Perhaps," she heard herself saying, "troubles are not entirely dependent upon station." The words hung between them in the misty air, far more revealing than anything she had intended to say. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Evangeline felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the rain that was beginning to penetrate her velvet riding habit. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose they are." He secured his medical bag behind his saddle with movements that suggested long practice. "I am bound for the Morrison farm. Their youngest child has developed a fever that has the family quite concerned. Would you, that is, if your route takes you in that direction?" The invitation was improper by every standard she had been taught. A young lady of her station should not ride unaccompanied with a gentleman, particularly one who was neither a relative nor a suitor approved by her family. But the prospect of extending this conversation, of learning more about this man who seemed to inhabit a world governed by different principles than her own, was too tempting to resist. "I believe I know the Morrison farm," she said, mounting Artemis with more haste than grace. "The gray stone house near the old mill?" "The same." He swung into his own saddle with easy confidence. Though I feel I should warn you that my medical rounds are not always pleasant. The realities of illness and poverty are far removed from the drawing rooms of Mayfair. Perhaps that is not entirely a disadvantage, she replied, urging Artemis forward to ride beside him. I sometimes think that drawing rooms reveal less truth than they conceal. He looked at her with new interest, as though her response had surprised him. That is a remarkably sophisticated observation from someone who has spent her life in those very drawing rooms. You think me naive because of my circumstances? There was challenge in her voice, though she was not entirely sure why his opinion mattered so much to her. Not naive, he said after a moment's consideration. But perhaps, protected. There is a difference between understanding hardship intellectually and witnessing it firsthand. They rode in companionable silence for several minutes, their horses' hooves making soft sounds on the muddy lane while the rain continued its gentle persistence. The countryside around them seemed different somehow when viewed from beside him, not the familiar landscape of her childhood, but a place where real people lived real lives filled with genuine concerns. Tell me about your practice, she said eventually. What drew you to medicine? His expression grew thoughtful, and she could see him considering how much to reveal to someone whose world was so different from his own. My father was a physician in Edinburgh, he said finally. I grew up watching him tend to everything from minor ailments to life-threatening diseases, treating rich and poor with equal dedication. It seemed meaningful in a way that purely social pursuits never could. Meaningful, she repeated, testing the word. Yes, I think I understand that. Do you? There was genuine curiosity in his voice. What gives meaning to your life, Lady Evangeline? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her such a thing before. Her life's meaning was assumed to be self-evident: marriage to an appropriate gentleman, management of his households, production of heirs to continue ancient bloodlines. But when she tried to articulate these expectations, they seemed suddenly hollow. She began, then stopped. I'm not sure I've ever considered the question quite that way. Then perhaps you should, he said gently. A life without purpose, no matter how privileged, can become its own form of suffering. They had reached the Morrison farm, a modest stone house surrounded by fields where sheep grazed despite the rain. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Evangeline could see signs of the anxiety that illness brings to a household: curtains drawn against the morning light, children playing quietly near the door instead of ranging freely across the farmyard. I should see to my patient, Mr. Sinclair said, dismounting and retrieving his medical bag. The ride back to Ashworth Manor is pleasant but lonely in this weather. Perhaps you would prefer to wait inside where it's warm and dry. The suggestion was practical and considerate, but Evangeline found herself curious about what he actually did in his professional capacity. Might I, that is, would it be appropriate for me to observe? I have never seen a physician at work. He studied her face carefully, as though trying to determine whether her interest was genuine or merely fashionable curiosity. It would be highly unusual, he said finally. And young Tommy Morrison has a fever that may require treatment some would consider undignified. I am not as fragile as my circumstances might suggest, she replied with more confidence than she felt. And I think I would value seeing something real rather than merely decorative. The smile that spread across his face was different from any expression she had ever inspired in a gentleman, warm and approving and somehow proud. Very well, Lady Evangeline. But you must promise to tell me immediately if you feel faint or uncomfortable. Mrs. Morrison, a capable woman of middle years whose hands spoke of a lifetime's honest work, received them with the mixture of gratitude and nervousness that the gentry's unexpected presence always inspired. But her anxiety for her son quickly overcame social considerations. He's been fevering since yesterday evening, sir, she explained, leading them toward a small bedroom where a boy of perhaps 8 lay restlessly in a narrow bed. "Won't take food or drink, and his breathing sounds strange." Evangeline watched as Mr. Sinclair approached the sick child with gentle competence, his manner calm and reassuring as he began his examination. He listened to the boy's breathing, felt for the pulse at his wrist, examined his throat and ears with instruments designed for the purpose. "Inflammation of the throat and bronchial passages," he murmured, more to himself than to his observers. "But not severe enough to cause serious alarm." He turned to Mrs. Morrison with a smile that seemed to ease her anxiety immediately. "Young Tommy will recover fully, but he'll need careful nursing for several days." What followed was a detailed explanation of the treatment required: herbal teas to ease the inflammation, cool cloths for the fever, specific foods that would be easy to swallow. But what struck Evangeline most powerfully was the way Mr. Sinclair spoke to Mrs. Morrison, not as a social superior addressing an inferior, but as one competent person consulting with another about a shared concern. "You're certain he'll be well, sir?" Mrs. Morrison asked, her relief evident but still tinged with maternal worry. "As certain as medical knowledge allows," he replied. "But you must send for me immediately if his condition worsens." "Day or night, Mrs. Morrison, a child's health is never a matter to be delayed for convenience." The casual assumption that he would come whenever needed, regardless of the hour or weather, seemed to Evangeline revolutionary in its implications. This was a man who had chosen to dedicate his life to serving others, who found purpose in relieving suffering rather than accumulating wealth or status. When they finally took their leave, with promises to return the following day to check on the patient's progress, Evangeline felt as though she had witnessed something transformative. The rain had stopped during their visit, and weak sunlight was beginning to pierce the clouds, casting the wet countryside in shades of gold and green. "Thank you," she said as they mounted their horses for the return journey, "for allowing me to accompany you. I have never seen, that is, I have never witnessed someone actually helping another person in such a direct way. Surely your charitable work with the church provides similar satisfaction," he suggested. Evangeline thought of the carefully orchestrated charity events that occupied much of her time, elaborate fundraising dinners where more money was spent on decorations than actually reached the poor, committees that spent months planning events that could have been organized in days. "It's not the same," she admitted. "We raise funds, we organize committees, but we rarely touch the actual need." They rode in comfortable silence for several minutes, but Evangeline found herself increasingly aware of the man beside her. Everything about him seemed to radiate competence and purpose: the way he sat his horse, the manner in which he had handled his medical examination, the genuine concern he had shown for people whose only value to him lay in their shared humanity. "Mr. Sinclair," she said suddenly, the words emerging before she could consider their wisdom. Do you have family? A wife, perhaps?" The question was improper, far too personal for their brief acquaintance, but she found herself desperately curious about his circumstances. The possibility that he might be married, that her growing fascination with him was both pointless and inappropriate, seemed suddenly crucial to determine. "No wife," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I was engaged once, in Edinburgh, but the lady decided that a physician's life was too uncertain for her taste. She married a banker instead, a man with regular hours and predictable income." "I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, but his loss seemed to explain something about the solitary quality she had sensed in him. "Don't be. Margaret made the practical choice, and I cannot fault her for it. A physician's wife must be prepared for interrupted dinners, night calls, and the reality that her husband's first loyalty will always be to his patient's needs." He glanced at her with an expression she could not quite read. "It requires a particular kind of woman to accept such a life." The comment seemed laden with meanings beyond its surface, and Evangeline felt her pulse quicken as she considered its implications. Was he suggesting that she might be such a woman? Or merely explaining why his chosen profession made conventional marriage difficult? They had reached the boundary between the village and Ashworth lands, marked by ancient stone pillars that bore the family coat of arms. Beyond lay the familiar landscape of her childhood, but it no longer seemed like home so much as a beautiful prison designed to contain her until she could be transferred to another, equally luxurious cage. "I should return," she said reluctantly, though every fiber of her being wanted to continue riding beside him, to learn more about his world and the choices that had shaped it. "Yes," he agreed, but made no immediate move to part company. "Lady Evangeline, what we discussed today, your questions about meaning and purpose. I hope I have not spoken inappropriately." "Not at all." She turned in her saddle to face him fully, struck by the sincerity in his dark eyes. "You have given me much to consider." "And your engagement?" The question was careful, but she could hear the deeper inquiry beneath it. "The Duke of Whitmore is satisfied with the arrangements." "The Duke is satisfied with everything that satisfies his interests," she replied, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "The arrangement is advantageous to both families in every measurable way." "Measurable," he repeated thoughtfully. "And the unmeasurable aspects?" She could not answer immediately, for the question struck too close to the heart of her growing discontent. How could she explain to this man who had chosen his own path in life that she had never been allowed to consider what might make her truly happy? "I should go," she said finally, gathering her reins with hands that had begun to tremble. "But I am glad we met today. Thank you for showing me something real. Lady Evangeline." His voice stopped her as she was about to urge Artemis forward. "If you ever need, that is, if you ever require the services of a physician, or simply someone to listen without judgment, I am at your service." The offer was made with careful propriety, but she heard the deeper invitation beneath the words. Here was a man offering her friendship, understanding, perhaps even something more, but only if she was brave enough to reach for it. "Thank you," she whispered, and rode away before she could say something that would change everything irrevocably. But as Ashworth Manor came into view with its perfect Georgian facade and its precisely manicured grounds, Lady Evangeline Ashworth realized that everything had already changed. She had glimpsed another way of living, another way of being, and the knowledge would not be easily forgotten. For the first time in her life, she began to consider whether duty and happiness might not be the same thing at all. 3 weeks had passed since Evangeline's encounter with Marcus Sinclair at the Morrison farm, and every day had brought increasing torment to her once-ordered existence. She moved through the elaborate preparations for her wedding with mechanical precision, attending fittings for her trousseau, approving floral arrangements for the ceremony, and receiving instruction from the Countess on the management of a ducal household. But beneath the surface compliance, a revolution was brewing. Late at night, when the manor house settled into quiet and the servants had retired to their quarters, Evangeline found herself standing at her bedroom window, staring out at the dark landscape and wondering if she possessed the courage to claim the life she truly wanted. The wedding was now only 3 weeks away. Invitations had been sent to 300 of England's most illustrious families. Westminster Abbey had been reserved for the ceremony, and the Prince Regent himself had indicated his intention to attend. The Ashworth diamonds had been reset in a new tiara designed specifically for the occasion, and Madame Laurent had declared the wedding gown her masterpiece, a creation of Brussels lace and seed pearls that would, according to the Countess, ensure Evangeline's place in history as one of England's most beautiful brides. But beauty, Evangeline had come to understand, was not the same as happiness. And duty, no matter how perfectly executed, could not fill the growing emptiness in her heart. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Evangeline sat in the morning room with her mother, reviewing the final details of the wedding breakfast menu while rain drummed against the tall windows. The Duke was expected for luncheon, and there were still questions about the seating arrangements for the high table that required resolution. The Archbishop's preference for fish courses must be accommodated, the Countess was saying, her attention focused on the elaborately detailed menu cards that had been prepared by London's finest caterers. But we cannot slight the Prince Regent's fondness for game birds. Perhaps if we offer both. A knock at the door interrupted her planning. "Enter," the Countess called without looking up from her papers. "Begging your pardon, my lady," said Peters, the butler whose dignity had never wavered during 40 years of service to the Ashworth family. "But there's been an urgent message from the village. Young Tommy Morrison has taken a turn for the worse, and his mother is asking if Lady Evangeline might come. She says the boy keeps asking for the lady who visited with Dr. Sinclair." Evangeline felt her heart leap at the mention of Marcus's name, but concern for the child quickly overcame any personal considerations. "Of course I'll come," she said, rising immediately. "Have Patterson saddle Artemis at once." "Evangeline," her mother's voice carried sharp disapproval. "Surely a message of sympathy and perhaps some appropriate remedy from our own physician would suffice. You cannot go traipsing about the countryside when the Duke is expected for luncheon. A child is ill, mother. How can considerations of convenience possibly outweigh such need?" Evangeline was already moving toward the door, her mind focused on reaching the Morrison farm as quickly as possible. "Because you are not simply Evangeline anymore," the Countess replied with steel in her voice. "You are the future Duchess of Whitmore, and every action you take reflects upon both our family and the Duke's. Visiting cottagers, no matter how worthy the cause, is not appropriate behavior for a woman of your station." The words stopped Evangeline in her tracks, not because they convinced her, but because they crystallized everything she had been feeling for weeks. She was not to be Evangeline anymore, but rather a title, a role, a carefully managed symbol of aristocratic perfection. Her own instincts, her own compassion, her own desires were to be subordinated to the requirements of status and social expectation. "I see," she said quietly. "And if I refuse to accept these limitations? If I insist on following my own conscience rather than society's dictates?" The Countess studied her daughter with the sharp attention of a general assessing potential rebellion in the ranks. "Then you would bring scandal upon our family name, break your father's heart, and destroy any possibility of the advantageous marriage that will secure your future and that of generations to come. Is that truly what you wish?" For a moment, Evangeline wavered. The weight of family expectation, of duty inherited through generations, of the comfortable security that her engagement represented, pressed down upon her like a physical force. It would be so much easier to submit, to accept the path that had been laid out for her, to become the perfect Duchess that everyone expected. But then she thought of Marcus Sinclair's gentle hands caring for young Tommy, of the genuine concern in his voice when he spoke of his patients, of the way his eyes had lit up when she had shown interest in real work rather than social performance. She thought of the emptiness that stretched ahead of her if she married the Duke, years of managing households and entertaining guests and producing heirs, all while her true self withered away beneath the weight of aristocratic duty. "Mother," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I am going to the Morrison farm because a child who trusted me enough to ask for my presence is suffering. If that brings scandal, then perhaps our notions of propriety are in need of examination." She left the room before the Countess could respond, moving through the corridors of Ashworth Manor with new purpose. Her riding habit of deep blue wool was waiting in her dressing room, and Sarah helped her change with the efficiency born of long practice, though the maid's face showed concern at this departure from routine. "Miss Evangeline," Sarah said carefully as she adjusted the buttons on the habit's fitted jacket, "your mother seemed, displeased when I passed her in the corridor just now. My mother will adapt, Evangeline replied, though she knew the statement was far from certain. Sarah, what would you do if you had to choose between duty and happiness? Between what others expected and what your heart demanded? The older woman's hand stilled for a moment. That's not a choice I've ever been fortunate enough to face, miss. But if I had been, I think I'd have to ask myself which choice I could live with 20 years from now. 20 years. Evangeline tried to imagine herself at 42, surrounded by the luxury and status that marriage to the Duke would provide, but emotionally starved and spiritually empty. The prospect was more terrifying than any scandal society might create. The ride to the Morrison farm seemed both endless and far too short. With every mile, Evangeline felt herself moving further from the world she had always known and closer to possibilities she had never dared to consider. The countryside around her no longer looked like familiar territory but like the landscape of a foreign country where different rules might apply. She found Marcus's horse tied outside the Morrison cottage, and her heart performed an irregular rhythm at the sight. When Mrs. Morrison answered her knock, the relief on the woman's face was evident and deeply moving. "Oh, my lady, thank you for coming," she said, ushering Evangeline inside. "Tommy's been asking for you special-like. Dr. Sinclair says the fever's broken, but the boy won't rest easy until he sees you're real and not just something he dreamed." The cottage's interior was simple but spotlessly clean, warmed by a fire that cast dancing shadows across whitewashed walls. Marcus stood beside the narrow bed where young Tommy lay, his medical bag open on a nearby chair. He looked up as she entered, and the expression of surprise and pleasure that crossed his face made her feel as though she had come home. "Lady Evangeline," he said, rising to bow slightly. "I didn't expect, that is, I'm pleased you could come." "How could I not?" she replied, moving to the bedside where Tommy's large eyes tracked her movement with the intensity of childhood. "Hello, Tommy. I hear you've been asking for me." "Yes, ma'am," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse from illness. "I wanted to make sure you was real. Sometimes when I'm poorly, I dream things that ain't true." Evangeline felt her heart contract at the simple honesty of his words. Here was someone who valued her presence not for her title or her fortune, but simply for herself. "I'm quite real," she assured him, settling into the chair beside his bed. "And Dr. Sinclair tells me you're going to be completely well very soon." "He's been real good to me," Tommy said, his gaze shifting to Marcus with obvious hero worship. "Says when I'm grown I might be a doctor too, if I study hard and learn my letters proper." "That's a fine ambition," Evangeline agreed, glancing at Marcus and seeing the gentle encouragement in his expression. "Dr. Sinclair is quite right, with education and determination, you could become anything you choose to be." They stayed for nearly an hour, with Marcus checking on his patient's progress while Evangeline entertained Tommy with stories that made him laugh despite his weakness. Watching Marcus work, seeing the easy rapport he had established not only with the sick child but with his parents, Evangeline felt a profound sense of rightness that was entirely new to her experience. This was what life could be like, meaningful, connected, filled with genuine purpose rather than mere social obligation. Marcus had chosen to dedicate his skills to healing, to making the world better in small but significant ways. Mrs. Morrison treated him with the respect due to competence and compassion rather than inherited rank. Even young Tommy looked at him with an admiration based on what he did rather than what he owned. When they finally took their leave, with promises to return the following day, the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. Marcus walked beside her to where their horses waited, and Evangeline found herself reluctant to return to Ashworth Manor and the confrontation she knew awaited her there. "Thank you," Marcus said as they reached their mounts. "Your presence meant a great deal to the family, and to Tommy especially. Children often recover more quickly when they feel cared for by people beyond their immediate family. It meant a great deal to me as well, she replied honestly. More than you might realize. He studied her face with the careful attention she had learned to associate with his medical training. Lady Evangeline, forgive me if I speak too freely, but you seem troubled. Is there anything I might do to help? The simple offer of assistance, made without calculation or expectation of advantage, nearly undid her composure entirely. When had anyone last asked what they might do for her, rather than what she might do for them? She began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she wanted to say. How could she explain that she was trapped in a life that felt increasingly like a beautifully appointed prison? How could she tell him that his kindness to a sick child had shown her everything she was missing in her own existence? Perhaps, he said gently, we might walk for a few minutes. The afternoon is pleasant, and I find that movement often helps when one is wrestling with difficult thoughts. They left their horses tied to the garden gate and strolled along the lane that wound through the village. The simple houses with their garden plots and chimney smoke seemed to mock the elaborate grandeur of Evangeline's world with their very unpretentiousness. Here, people lived according to their own needs and desires rather than the dictates of social position. Marcus, she said suddenly, using his given name for the first time and noting how naturally it came to her lips. What would you say to someone who was expected to live a life that felt entirely wrong to them? Someone who had been given every material advantage but felt as though they were dying inside. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious and intent. I would say that no amount of external comfort can compensate for internal suffering. And I would ask what that person truly wanted from their life. Freedom, she said without hesitation. The chance to choose their own path, to find purpose beyond social obligation, to love someone who valued them for themselves rather than their connections. And what prevents them from claiming such a life? Fear, she admitted. Fear of disappointing those who have expectations, fear of social disgrace, fear of losing the security they have always known. She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. Fear that the person they might love could never return their feelings because of the enormous differences in their circumstances. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Evangeline felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for his response. She had revealed too much, spoken too freely, but the words had poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Evangeline, he said finally, and her name on his lips sounded like music. Are you asking me what I think you're asking? I don't know, she whispered. Am I? He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the clean scent of soap and medicinal herbs that seemed to cling to his clothing. If you are suggesting that a physician of modest means might dare to love an earl's daughter, if you are implying that such a woman might consider abandoning wealth and status for an uncertain future with a man who has nothing to offer but his devotion. Yes, she breathed. That is exactly what I am suggesting. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Marcus reached out and took her hands in his, and the warmth of his touch seemed to flow through her entire body like sunlight after a long winter. Then I must tell you, he said, his voice low and intense, that I have been fighting my feelings for you since the moment we met. I have told myself 100 times that the distance between our worlds makes such love impossible, that I have no right to court disaster by declaring myself to a woman so far above my station. And now, she asked, hardly daring to breathe. Now I think that love recognizes no boundaries except those we create for ourselves. And I think that a woman brave enough to abandon wealth for happiness deserves a man willing to risk everything for her. The kiss that followed was nothing like the polite, calculated gestures she had received from approved suitors. Marcus kissed her as though she were precious beyond measure, as though he had been waiting his entire life for this moment, as though he understood that she was offering him not just her heart but her entire future. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, Evangeline felt as though she had been reborn. The world looked different, felt different, full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "What happens now?" she asked, acutely aware that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. "Now," Marcus said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with infinite tenderness, "you must decide whether you have the courage to choose love over duty, whether you can face the consequences of following your heart rather than society's expectations." "And if I do? If I choose you over everything else I have ever known?" His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Then we build a life together based on love rather than obligation, on purpose rather than privilege. It won't be easy, Evangeline. I can offer you a physician's income, a modest home, the respect of people who value skill and compassion over titles and wealth. But I cannot offer you luxury or status or the approval of the world you were born to." "And can you offer me love?" she asked. "True partnership? The chance to be valued for who I am rather than what I represent?" "That," he said, pulling her close again, "I can offer you every day for the rest of our lives." The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. "Then I choose you," she said simply. "I choose love over duty, happiness over security, truth over appearance. Whatever the cost, Marcus, I choose you." The scandal, when it broke, was everything the Countess had predicted and more. Lady Evangeline Ashworth's flight from her engagement 3 days before her wedding to the Duke of Whitmore became the sensation of the season. Drawing rooms from London to Edinburgh buzzed with speculation and condemnation. The Earl disinherited his daughter publicly, while the Duke announced that he considered himself well rid of a woman who had revealed herself to be unsuitable for the dignity of his position. But in a small cottage near the village where Dr. Marcus Sinclair practiced medicine, none of the social upheaval mattered. Evangeline had shed her title along with her wealth, becoming simply Mrs. Sinclair, the physician's wife who assisted her husband in his practice and found more satisfaction in helping to deliver a healthy baby than she had ever found in all the elaborate entertainments of her former life. They married quietly in the village church, with Tommy Morrison as their witness and Mrs. Morrison providing the simple wedding breakfast. Evangeline wore a dress of cream silk that had cost less than the ribbon on her discarded wedding gown, but she had never felt more beautiful or more complete. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked her on their wedding night as they stood together in the garden of their modest home, watching stars emerge in the clear sky above. "Only one," she replied, turning in his arms to face the man who had taught her that love was worth any sacrifice. "That it took me so long to find the courage to choose happiness." Years later, when their own children played in the same garden where Tommy Morrison had once been a patient, Evangeline would tell them the story of how she had abandoned wealth to love freely. She would explain that true riches came not from what one owned but from what one shared, not from what society valued but from what the heart treasured. And she would tell them that sometimes the greatest courage was required not to accept what seemed inevitable, but to reach for what seemed impossible. In choosing love over duty, in abandoning the golden cage of privilege for the uncertain freedom of authentic life, Lady Evangeline Ashworth had discovered that the heart's truest desires were worth any price the world might demand.